When I was 8, my life shattered. My dad, my hero, passed away unexpectedly. I remember the day vividly, the heavy silence in the house, the muffled conversations of adults trying to shield me from the reality I was too young to understand. At the funeral, I clung to my grandparents while staring at the closed casket, waiting for someone to tell me this wasn't real. But no one did. My dad was gone, and the world felt colder without him. In the months that followed, I tried to adjust to life without him. It wasn't easy. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of him. His favorite coffee mug still on the kitchen counter, the baseball glove we used to toss around in the backyard, the half-fixed fence he promised to finish once he had time. I found some comfort in knowing my mom was there, someone to share the loss with, but she didn't seem as lost as I was. A few months after the funeral, she introduced Todd. He was tall, with a loud laugh that grated on me the moment I heard it. My mom smiled more around him, and at first, I thought that was a good thing. Then she told me she wanted me to call him Dad. I froze. It wasn't just the word. It was the idea of replacing my dad, as if he were some old toy she could swap out for a newer one. I refused, and I could tell by her reaction she wasn't happy about it. Todd started coming around more, and suddenly, everything that was ours started feeling like his. He sat in my dad's chair at the dinner table. He used my dad's tools from the garage. And then, one day, I walked into the living room and saw Todd wearing my dad's watch, the one he only wore on special occasions. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I didn't say anything. I didn't know how. Before I could process what was happening, my mom and Todd announced they were getting married. The wedding was big, with white chairs and fancy table settings that felt out of place for something that wasn't supposed to be a first. I sat off to the side, watching as they exchanged vows, feeling like an outsider at my own mother's life. The worst part? She didn't even notice. After the wedding, things changed quickly. Todd moved in with his 2 kids, Stephanie and Tyler, both older than me and just as loud as their dad. Suddenly, my quiet house was filled with noise, laughing, arguing. The sound of a family that didn't feel like mine. My mom started spending all her time with them, planning family dinners, movie nights, and weekend outings. I was invited, but only out of obligation. It was clear where her priorities were. Then one day, she told me I'd be staying with my grandparents for a little while. She said it so casually, as if she were talking about a sleepover. She packed my things without asking and drove me to their house, barely looking at me in the rearview mirror. When I asked how long I'd be staying, she smiled and said, "We'll see." At first, I thought it was temporary. I kept waiting for her to come back, to tell me I could go home. Every time the phone rang, I hoped it was her. But days turned into weeks, and then months. She visited a few times, always with excuses about how busy things were or how much Stephanie and Tyler needed her. I stopped asking when I could come home. I stopped expecting her to care. Living with my grandparents wasn't bad. They were kind, steady, and always made me feel wanted in a way my mom never did. My grandpa taught me how to fix things around the house, and my grandma always made sure I had my favorite snacks. But no matter how much they tried to make me feel at home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being abandoned. Years later, when I was old enough to understand, my grandparents told me the truth. My mom didn't send me to live with them because they needed help around the house, as she claimed. She sent me away because there wasn't enough room for me anymore. My room, the one my dad had painted blue because I said it reminded me of the sky, had been given to Stephanie. Todd's kids needed the space, so I had to go. That's when I stopped hoping she'd come back for me. As I got older, I learned to stop looking back. My mom's visits became more sporadic until they stopped altogether. At first, I felt the absence acutely, like a dull ache that wouldn't go away. But over time, it hardened into resentment. I couldn't wrap my head around how easily she pushed me aside. Whenever I asked my grandparents why she did it, they'd try to soften the truth, saying things like, "She just needs time to figure things out," or "She loves you in her own way." But I could see in their eyes that they didn't believe it either. By the time I reached high school, my mom felt like a distant memory. My grandparents were my real family, and I leaned on them for everything. They showed up for parent-teacher conferences, cheered for me at soccer games, and sat through my awkward school plays. They gave me the stability I desperately needed, and I tried my best not to think about the woman who'd left me behind. When I graduated, my mom sent a card. It was generic, with a pre-written message inside, and she'd signed her name with a flourish as though that made it personal. There wasn't even a handwritten note, just her name and a check for $100. It felt more like an obligation than a gesture of pride. I didn't bother calling to thank her. What was the point? After high school, I moved out of my grandparents' house, but I stayed close to them. They were getting older, and I wanted to be around in case they needed anything. I got a job in marketing at a small firm in town. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I figured it was a stepping stone to something bigger. I didn't know what that something bigger was yet, but I had time to figure it out. Around that time, I started thinking about my dad's house. It had always been in the back of my mind, this piece of my childhood that felt both lost and out of reach. My grandparents had told me when I was younger that my dad had left it to me in his will. He'd made it airtight, ensuring that no one, not even my mom, could take it from me. I hadn't given it much thought over the years, but now that I was an adult, it felt like the right time to reclaim it. The idea started small. At first, I just wanted to see the house again, to walk through it and remember what it felt like to live there. But as I thought about it more, it became clear that I needed to do something with it. My job wasn't fulfilling, and I had this nagging feeling that I was meant for more. I started dreaming about starting my own business, something that would give me independence and purpose. The house could be the key to making that happen. If I leased it out, I could use the income to fund my idea. The thought of calling my mom made my stomach churn, but I knew I had to. I wasn't naive enough to think she'd be thrilled about the idea of leaving, but I hoped she'd at least understand that it was time. The first call went unanswered. So did the second and third. I left a voicemail, keeping it polite but firm, and asked her to call me back. She didn't. A few days later, I mentioned my plan to my grandparents over dinner. They exchanged a look that immediately set off alarm bells. My grandpa sighed and put down his fork, his expression heavy with hesitation. "Your mom and Todd, they're not doing so well," he said. I asked what he meant, and the story came out in bits and pieces. Todd had lost his full-time job and was barely getting by on part-time work at a hardware store. Jessica, his daughter, had dropped out of college and was now pregnant by a guy who disappeared as soon as he heard the news. The family was struggling to make ends meet, and my house was their only safety net. Hearing this didn't change my mind, but it did complicate things. I wanted to feel bad for them. I really did. But every time I thought about their situation, all I could remember was the day my mom drove me to my grandparents' house and left me there. She hadn't cared about me then. Why should I care about her now? My grandparents, ever the peacekeepers, tried to convince me to give them time. "Maybe you could wait a few more months," my grandma suggested. "They're not in a good place right now." I nodded, but inside, I felt a storm brewing. They'd had years to figure out their lives, years to prepare for the day I'd want my house back. This wasn't my problem to solve. The next week, I decided to visit the house in person. If my mom wouldn't answer my calls, she could hear me out face to face. As I drove up the familiar street, my chest tightened. The house looked different, older, more worn down. The lawn was overgrown, and the paint on the shutters was peeling. It didn't feel like the home I remembered. When my mom answered the door, she looked surprised. Not happy, not angry, just surprised. She gave me a half-hearted hug and asked, "What brings you here?" As if we were acquaintances catching up. I stepped inside and noticed the smell first. Stale air mixed with something faintly sour. The walls were cluttered with decorations that weren't ours, and the furniture was bulky and mismatched. It didn't feel like my house anymore. It felt like theirs. I didn't mention the house right away. Instead, I tried to ease into the conversation, asking how she was and how everyone was doing. She gave me short answers, clearly uninterested. After a few awkward minutes, I brought it up. "I've been thinking about leasing the house," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "I need it for a business I'm starting." Her reaction was immediate. She stiffened, her polite smile vanishing. "You can't be serious," she said, crossing her arms. "This is our home." I reminded her it wasn't, not legally at least. She tried to argue, saying my dad would never have wanted this, but I held firm. The conversation ended with her saying she needed time to think, and I left feeling more conflicted than ever. After that conversation, I gave my mom some time, hoping she'd realize there wasn't much to argue about. The house legally belonged to me, and I wasn't trying to throw them out without warning. I just needed to move forward with my plans. But weeks passed, and I heard nothing. No calls, no texts, no follow-ups. It was like she decided to ignore the problem altogether, hoping it would go away. Frustrated, I decided to visit my grandparents and tell them what had happened. When I walked in, my grandma gave me a nervous smile, as if she already knew why I was there. My grandpa didn't even try to sugarcoat it this time. "She's not going to leave without a fight," he said flatly. I asked what he meant, and he told me that my mom had been venting to them about how unfair it was for me to even suggest taking the house back. She'd gone on about how they had nowhere else to go, how the family was struggling, and how I was being cold-hearted. My grandma, ever the peacekeeper, tried to soften the blow. "She's scared, sweetheart," she said gently. "You know how your mom gets when she feels backed into a corner." It was hard to tell if that was supposed to make me feel bad or more patient, but it didn't matter. "She's had years to figure this out," I said, the frustration clear in my voice. I gave her time. "I've been more than reasonable. Why does she think she's entitled to stay forever?" My grandpa nodded, but my grandma hesitated. "It's not about entitlement. It's about pride. She doesn't want to admit she needs help, even if it's her own doing." I didn't want to argue with them. They'd always tried to see the best in people, even when those people didn't deserve it. But I wasn't in the mood to let my mom's pride dictate my life anymore. The next day, I called my lawyer and explained the situation. He reviewed my dad's will and reassured me that everything was still airtight. "If they're not paying rent and you're the legal owner, you're within your rights to evict them," he said. "But I'd recommend sending a formal notice first. Give them a chance to leave voluntarily." I drafted the notice with his help, giving my mom and her family 30 days to vacate the property. I tried to word it as carefully as possible, avoiding anything that might make it sound personal, but deep down, I knew it would feel like a betrayal to her no matter how polite I was. Once the notice was finalized, my lawyer sent it out, and I waited. A few days later, I got a voicemail from her. I could hear the anger in her voice before she even started speaking. "I can't believe you do this to your own family," she spat. "What kind of son kicks his mother out of her home? After everything I've done for you?" She didn't bother to mention what exactly she'd done for me, but she kept going. "You think this is what your father would have wanted? For you to treat me like this?" It was the same guilt-tripping I'd heard my whole life, and it rolled off me like water off a duck. She'd used my dad as a shield for her decisions for as long as I could remember, and I wasn't falling for it anymore. I didn't call her back. Instead, I forwarded the voicemail to my lawyer as documentation and moved on. Over the next week, the voicemails kept coming. Some were angry, full of threats and accusations. Others were softer, dripping with faux remorse. "I made mistakes, but I don't deserve this," she'd say, as if acknowledging her faults excused everything else. I blocked her number after the 5th message. That's when Todd got involved. He left a voicemail too, but his was more aggressive. "You're making a big mistake, kid," he said. "You don't know who you're messing with. If you come near my family again, you'll regret it." His words were laughable, but I saved the voicemail anyway. If he thought he could intimidate me, he had no idea who he was dealing with. The real escalation came when Jessica, Todd's daughter, showed up at my grandparents' house unannounced. I wasn't there at the time, but my grandma called me afterward, clearly shaken. Jessica had shown up with her baby, crying about how they had nowhere else to go and begging them to talk me out of the eviction. When my grandparents tried to explain that it wasn't their decision, she turned nasty, accusing them of raising me to be selfish and ungrateful. Hearing that made my blood boil. Jessica had never been more than an annoyance to me growing up, and now she was trying to guilt-trip my grandparents, the only people who'd ever truly cared about me. It was the last straw. I told my lawyer to move forward with the eviction. No delays, no extensions. The formal eviction process started a few days later. My lawyer sent the necessary paperwork to the county court, and we set a date for the sheriff to enforce the eviction if they refused to leave voluntarily. It wasn't what I wanted. I hated the idea of things getting that far, but my mom and her family had left me no choice. As the days ticked down, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I was angry at how entitled they'd acted, how they'd twisted everything to make me seem like the villain. On the other hand, there was a part of me that still felt guilty, that still wondered if I was being too harsh. But every time I thought about backing down, I remembered the years I spent waiting for her to come back, waiting for her to care. This wasn't about revenge. It was about finally standing up for myself, even if it meant burning the last bridge between us. The countdown to the eviction day felt surreal. I'd never imagined I'd be in a position where I had to legally remove my own mother and her family from the house my dad left me. It wasn't what I wanted, but they left me no other choice. I tried to push the guilt aside by focusing on the practical steps, ensuring the paperwork was in order, making arrangements with the sheriff, and preparing myself for whatever drama might unfold. The tension only escalated as the eviction date got closer. My mom, Todd, and even Jessica ramped up their efforts to guilt-trip me. Todd called me again, this time threatening to pay me a visit if I didn't drop the eviction. Jessica sent me long, rambling texts about how I was ruining her life and how hard it was to raise a baby without a stable home. My mom tried a different tactic, calling my grandparents to beg them to intervene. She cried, claiming she didn't know where else to go and that I was tearing the family apart. My grandparents, bless them, tried to stay out of it, but I could tell it was weighing on them. My grandma pulled me aside one evening and said, "I know you're doing what's right for you, but I just wish things didn't have to be this way." I could see the worry in her eyes, but I couldn't back down now. They've had every chance to make this right, I told her. They chose not to. This isn't on me anymore. The day before the eviction, I drove by the house to see if they were packing. It didn't look like it. The lawn was still overgrown. The blinds were drawn, and everything looked as it always had, neglected and lifeless. I parked down the street for a while, debating whether to knock on the door one last time, but I decided against it. Any conversation with them at this point would just turn into another round of shouting or manipulation. I couldn't deal with that anymore. The next morning, I met the sheriff and my lawyer at the house. My heart was pounding as we pulled up. I had no idea what to expect. Would they leave peacefully, or would this turn into a full-blown confrontation? As soon as we got out of the car, my mom opened the door and stepped outside, arms crossed and face like stone. Behind her, Todd and Jessica loomed in the doorway, both glaring at me like I was the enemy. "You really went through with it," my mom said, her voice dripping with contempt. "I didn't think you'd actually stoop this low." I ignored her and nodded to the sheriff, who handed her a copy of the court order. "You've had more than enough time to vacate the property," he said. "You need to leave today." Todd, of course, had to make a scene. "This is bullshit," he yelled, stepping forward like he was going to start something. "This house is ours. We've been living here for years. He can't just kick us out." The sheriff didn't flinch. "Sir, I suggest you calm down," he said firmly. "This is a legal eviction. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to escort you out." Todd looked like he wanted to argue more, but my mom grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "We're not going to give him the satisfaction," she hissed, loud enough for me to hear. Jessica, meanwhile, stood on the porch, holding her baby and muttering under her breath about how heartless I was. It took a few hours for them to pack up their things. The whole time, they made sure to let me know how they felt about me. My mom kept throwing out passive-aggressive comments like, "I hope you're happy now," and "You'll regret this someday." Todd muttered threats under his breath, but the sheriff's presence kept him from doing anything more. Jessica alternated between glaring at me and crying, using her baby as a shield for sympathy. I stayed quiet, watching from a distance, refusing to engage. When they finally finished, they handed the keys over to the sheriff. My mom turned to me one last time, her eyes full of anger and something that looked almost like hurt. "You've destroyed this family," she said. "I hope you can live with that." I didn't respond. What was there to say? They got into their car, slammed the doors, and drove off without looking back. For the first time in years, the house was mine again. Once they were gone, I walked inside and took a deep breath. The air was stale, and the place was a mess. Scratched floors, stained carpets, and walls covered in scuffs and peeling paint. It didn't feel like home anymore, but it felt like something I could rebuild. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking around at the wreckage, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't just a house. It was a fresh start. I spent the next few weeks cleaning and repairing everything. It was hard work, but it felt good to pour my energy into something tangible, something that was mine. My grandparents helped where they could, and every now and then, I'd catch my grandpa smiling at me like he was proud. It wasn't just about fixing the house. It was about reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd lost a long time ago. I listed the house for rent shortly after finishing the repairs and found tenants quickly. The rent money was enough to give me the financial cushion I needed to start my business, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward instead of being stuck in the past. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I questioned everything, but deep down, I knew I'd made the right choice. As for my mom and her family, I haven't heard from them since. Maybe they're still angry, or maybe they've finally moved on. Either way, it's not my problem anymore. For once, I'm free to focus on my own future, and that's all that matters. After the eviction, I thought things would finally settle down. The house was rented out, the tenants were happy, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The money from the lease gave me the freedom to focus on my business, and slowly, things started falling into place. I had clients trickling in, and every small success felt like a victory. It wasn't just about the money. It was about proving to myself that I could do this. But even as I moved forward, my mom and her family found ways to pull me back. The silence didn't last long. A few weeks after the eviction, I got a call from my grandparents. My mom had shown up at their house, uninvited and unannounced. She wasn't crying or yelling this time. She was calm, almost unnervingly so. According to my grandparents, she said she wanted to make amends. She claimed she'd been reflecting on her mistakes and wanted to rebuild her relationship with me. At first, my grandparents were hopeful. My grandma even said, maybe this is a turning point for her. But my grandpa wasn't convinced. He told me she'd spent most of the visit talking about how hard things had been for her and how unfairly I'd treated her. It didn't sound like she was there to take responsibility, he said, shaking his head. I wasn't surprised. My mom had a talent for twisting the narrative to make herself the victim. Still, part of me wanted to believe she was capable of change. I thought about reaching out, but every time I did, I remembered all the times I'd let my guard down before, only to end up hurt. So I didn't call. I didn't text. I just let it go. A week later, I got another call, this time from my tenants. They were panicked, saying that someone had been lurking outside the house at night. The man had knocked on the door, peered through the windows, and even left a note taped to the front door. When they sent me the footage from the security cameras, I immediately recognized Todd. He wasn't exactly subtle. The note he left was scrawled in messy handwriting and full of threats, accusing me of stealing the house and warning me to watch my back. It was ridiculous, but it also made my blood boil. This wasn't just about me anymore. My tenants didn't deserve to be dragged into this. I forwarded the footage and the note to my lawyer, who told me to report it to the police. When I filed the report, the officer at the desk raised an eyebrow at the name. This isn't the first time we've heard about him, he said. Apparently, Todd had a history of pulling stunts like this, but nothing ever stuck because he was careful to stay just on the edge of the law. The officer assured me they'd keep an eye on things, but it wasn't much comfort. Things escalated a few days later. Jessica showed up at my grandparents' house again, this time with the baby in tow. My grandma called me as soon as she left, her voice shaky with frustration. She was here for over an hour, she said, crying, yelling, trying to make us feel guilty. She kept saying she didn't know where else to go. I asked what they told her, and my grandpa chimed in. We told her it wasn't our decision and that she needed to talk to you. But she didn't like that answer. Apparently, when my grandparents refused to take her side, Jessica turned nasty. She accused them of enabling me and called me a selfish brat who didn't care about family. Hearing that made me see red. My grandparents had done nothing but support me and try to keep the peace, and now they were being dragged into the mess my mom and her family had created. The next time Todd left a threatening voicemail, I didn't hesitate. I went straight to the police and updated my report, adding the new evidence. My lawyer suggested filing for a restraining order, and I agreed. It felt extreme, but at this point, I didn't trust Todd or Jessica to stay away. Once the restraining order was in place, things finally started to quiet down. Todd stopped leaving voicemails, and Jessica didn't show up at my grandparents' house again. My mom, though, found a new tactic. She started sending me long, handwritten letters. The tone shifted with each one. Some were apologetic, full of promises to do better and pleas for forgiveness. Others were angry, accusing me of abandoning her and ruining the family. It was exhausting. I didn't respond to any of them. I kept the letters in a drawer, not because I wanted to keep them, but because my lawyer told me to save everything in case things escalated again. Every time I saw one of her envelopes in the mail, it was like a small weight pressing down on me. No matter how much I tried to move forward, she always found a way to drag me back. Despite all this, I refused to let them win. My business was growing, and I was starting to feel like I had a future worth fighting for. I poured all my energy into my work, building something that was mine and mine alone. The money from the house helped, but the real reward was the sense of independence I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I started thinking about what life could look like without the shadow of my mom and her family hanging over me. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the guilt crept back in, whispering that I'd been too harsh or that I should have done more to help. But then I remembered the years I spent waiting for her to care, and I knew I'd made the right choice. The house was no longer a source of stress. It was a symbol of everything I'd survived and everything I was building for myself. I wasn't looking back anymore. I was moving forward. Months passed, and the noise from my mom and her family finally faded into the background. The restraining order held them at bay, and the letters stopped coming. My tenants were settled, my business was thriving, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe without waiting for the next blow to land. One evening, while visiting my grandparents, my grandma brought out a small box. Inside was a collection of old photos and keepsakes my dad had left behind. Among them was a letter he'd written shortly before he passed. I'd never seen it before. It had been tucked away in a drawer for years. The letter wasn't long, but it hit me hard. He wrote about his hopes for my future, how he wanted me to be strong and never let anyone take away what was rightfully mine. It wasn't just about the house. It was about standing up for myself, even when it was hard. Reading his words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, like he was reminding me I'd made the right choice. I folded the letter and put it back in the box, a quiet sense of peace settling over me. The fight for the house, the endless guilt, the years of waiting for my mom to care. It was all behind me now. My dad's house wasn't just a place anymore. It was my foundation, my chance to build something that was truly mine. As I left my grandparents' house that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. It was time to stop looking back. My life was my own, and for the first time, I was ready to live it.